I'm Maria Del Rosso. I'm the director of the Fauquier Public Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this inaugural Barbara and Keith Severin Lecture featuring best-selling historian Patrick K. O'Donnell. Tonight we will revisit the espionage and intelligence behind the scenes of Great Civil War battles, particularly the work of John S. Mosby, a fellow who looms large in local history. But before that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Severins. Barbara and Keith were great fans of the public library. Barbara served on the library board for over 20 years, many as chairman of the board, and her husband, Keith, was president of the Friends of the Library. And I think both of them visited our library nearly every day. They understood that libraries are the beating hearts of their community, and that what we borrow from them pales in comparison from what we take away. We are so pleased that their son Kenneth chose to honor his parents by endowing an annual lecture in their name. A program like this requires support from all quarters. At the library, I'm blessed to work with a talented group of people who use their knowledge and dedication every day to serve the people of Fauquier County. The great and good work of the Friends of the Library must also be acknowledged. Now, for more about our guest author. In addition to the Unvanquished, Mr. O'Donnell is the author of 13 books and the recipient of numerous national awards. He served as a combat historian in a Marine rifle platoon during the Battle of Fallujah. He was an historical consultant for the award-winning miniseries Band of Brothers and for documentaries produced by the BBC, the History Channel, and Discovery. After tonight's presentation, Mr. O'Donnell has graciously agreed to sign books in the lobby, and the open book is on hand to sell Mr. O'Donnell's books. So, with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Patrick O'Donnell.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming tonight, and I want to thank the library for hosting me. This is a great event. I also want to thank a person that's important in my life, fiance, Dr. Lori Snyder, who's an eye surgeon and at Gainesville Associates. Just a wonderful person. But anyways, people have asked me, how did you find this story? And the answer to that question is all the books that I've written have found me in one way or another. And that's not a trite saying. This book found me about 9 years ago when I was driving on Rogues Road, and I saw a pitted old sign called the Greatwood Farm Engagement. And my first thought was, what on earth is the Greatwood Farm Engagement? And the Greatwood Farm Engagement really brought me into this entire world, which the Unvanquished is. It's a separate world of just key figures. It's a story about the American Civil War that we really haven't studied. The Unvanquished breaks a lot of ground on the hidden war and the irregular war and special operations. So I went and I parked the car and I walked over to the sign, and this is where John Singleton Mosby, who has a very special place in Warrenton, because this is where his home was after the war. A lot of key things happen here with him. He's buried here as well. But the story of the Greatwood Farm Engagement is a fascinating one. It's where they destroyed their first locomotive. And Mosby's Rangers, at this point, is only about a company of men, or more than 100 men or so. And they are dragging a mountain howitzer, a small gun that fires a pretty decent projectile. And they work their way through the enemy lines, which this area around Catlett Station and Vid Hill is heavily occupied by Union cavalry. They infiltrate there and they hide there at night near the tracks. And in the morning hours of late May 1863, they fire a shell into the locomotive and destroy it. And they then raid the train and all of its, whatever it's got in there, and steal anything of the cargo that is valuable. But they are in the midst of a giant Union cavalry encampment. And no sooner has the train been destroyed than they're basically running for their lives on horseback. And it's at the Grapewood Farm that they set up kind of a corridor of death. It's a long kind of pathway to the farm. Set up the howitzer on a small hill, and they shell the Union cavalry as it comes down. And I went there and I found what a fascinating story. And there's also, they were with a Union, a British volunteer who had fought in the Crimean War. And I found his grave nearby, and on the grave was a little tab that said Ranger. I thought, wow, this is an amazing story. And then I thought to myself, there's probably no way that I'll be able to write it because of the current political climate. And I thought to myself, well, it's amazing. And then it was about a year later that I found another sign. I was editing my book, The Unknowns, and I looked down on the side and there was a plaque to Jack Sterry, Jesse Scout. What is that? Jack Sterry, in 1862, right before the Second Battle of Manassas, was on the crossroads at the Plains, Virginia, right next to the front porch. And General Hood's corps was marching down the road, and Jack was there in Confederate uniform. And he was a Union cavalryman known as a Jesse Scout. He was there to convince General Hood that he needed to go down the road to Middleburg because the Confederate Army had retreated from Manassas, and that's where they needed to go. And he was very convincing on his story, on everything from the smallest details. And then they started to ask who this man was. Something wasn't adding up. Why did the orders, my orders are to go to Manassas, Hood states. How do you know this? Well, I ran into, I was told directly by General Lee that we needed to move Jackson, that we needed to move down to Middleburg, and just the story kind of unfolds, and Jack has one answer after another, and then they start to really unmask this person, and the story doesn't make quite much sense, and then they find a mortally wounded Confederate in the bushes, who then points to Sterry, saying that he was one of the men that killed me, and took his dispatches. And it's there that Jack Sterry is executed. He's hanged by Hood and the other Confederates. And he says in his dying words, just remember that I died as a Jesse Scout. And with those powerful words, I thought, wow, this is an amazing story. Turns out that there's never been a book about the Jesse Scouts in their full set of war in a nonfiction sense. And I began to research it. And the story then led me to, I'm the official historian for the OSS Society, which is the precursor to Special Operations Forces and later the Central Intelligence Agency. But in 1941, the United States did not possess Special Operations Forces. And the United States, or America, has a very rich history in irregular warfare, going all the way back to 1670 in Benjamin Church and the ranging forces to fight Native Americans, and then later on in the French and Indian War with Robert's Rangers. But the other common thread with this history is that the United States is not a learning organization. In other words, we develop something and then it's forgotten. In 1940, the United States didn't possess any Special Operations Forces, and Wild Bill Donovan was in charge of, in 1941, an agency called the Coordinator of Information, which would become the Office of Strategic Services. And he recognized that the United States is in great peril. that we did not have special operations forces. And it was his idea to look back at John Singleton Mosby and Mosby's Rangers and the irregular warfare that they had pioneered and developed in America's first modern war, the Civil War, but also to look at the Jesse Scouts and another sort of opaque organization that really hasn't been written about much, and that is the Confederate Secret Service. And this book is a complex deep dive into those three stories, but it is not a textbook. This is a narrative history that, as the Wall Street Journal said so eloquently and brilliantly in the review, that it's a book about putting you in the saddle of those who were there. And it begins with Jack Sterry's story, and then it moves forward in time. And the story of the Jesse Scouts is really an amazing one. And that is a story that is named after Jesse Fremont. And the story begins in 1861 when John C. Fremont is in charge of the Missouri Territory, and they have to somehow quell an area of the country that is in civil war, and it's a bitter civil war between neighbor against neighbor. There's no real boundaries. So there's a need for a regular warfare, special operations, sort of troops that can kind of move through that fog of war. And it's Fremont that comes up with the idea of using scouts from his past. He's known as the Pathfinder, or the great explorer of the American West. He had Kit Carson and others that he had in the American West, and he had some of his old hands, some of his great scouts that were there, and they trained some of his volunteers, which were a small group of men, maybe about 30 men or so, and they learned the trade craft and operated in many ways a lot like today's special operations forces, but they did something very unique at the time, and something very hazardous, and that was that they wore the enemy's uniform. And it's John C. Fremont's wife, Jessie, who many suspect is the person that gave the scouts the idea, and it's her namesake that they are named after, because they admired her tremendously. She was a remarkable woman for her age and time. She was a Renaissance woman. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is from a contemporary that said, she was the better man than her husband. She was just an extraordinary woman. And the scouts admired her and named themselves after her. And they start to develop and do really amazing things for Fremont. They're operating in and around areas where they infiltrate several forts, like Fort Donelson. One of the main characters is a guy by the name of John Carpenter. And Carpenter is wily. He's a braggart. You know, he always says that he can shoot better than anyone else. He's anti-slavery, real big abolitionist. But he infiltrates the fort, comes out, and then there's another story about how he impersonates a woman to escape. These guys are amazing. They take on aliases and legends and blend into whatever environment they're part of. But they have a dark side. They pretty much steal anything that's not locked down. And this doesn't sit well with the United States Army, because they're stealing things left and right. There's stories that I found at the National Archives where John Carpenter swindles old women and children on a riverboat. He tells them that they're going to have a performance, takes their money, and then disappears. This is the kind of guy they're dealing with. And eventually, Fremont and the others in the Army have had enough of him, and he's cashiered out. And this is it's 1862 time frame. It's almost the end of the Jesse Scouts, because Fremont, who is a major general at this time, is passed over for promotion by John Pope, and he decides to leave the Army. And it's really, in many ways, it looks like it's the end of the Jesse Scouts, but a small remnant remain. And they operate in West Virginia. And it's in West Virginia that this small corps expands, and they have to deal with many of the irregulars that are in that town, that area of West Virginia, which is a crossroads of the great railroads, the B&O, and major roadways, like Route 50 cuts through it. And it's here that there are minerals, and it's where much of these supplies from the Midwest are passing through. So it's important to the Union to protect it. But it's a divided area, deeply divided between North and South. And the Confederacy has a great interest in the area. And it's here that irregular troops really pop up. And it's here that the Jesse Scouts really cut their teeth. They are used in really remarkable way. They're conducting deep raids behind the lines to hit the southern railroads that are on the other side of the Virginia border. And some of the raids are just absolutely epic. And it's the Jesse Scouts that are out front on horseback in Confederate uniform that are leading the way for the armies to conduct the raid, but also gathering tactical intelligence. But it's sort of a new dimension sort of forms within this kind of cauldron in West Virginia. They need to deal with the irregular partisans that are there. And there's a group called Thurman's Rangers, and these are men of Appalachia. That entire area is mainly tied to the South. Their men fight for the South. And it's here that there is a very bitter and ruthless war that goes on between neighbors, where houses are burned out. And they need a way to deal with these irregulars. Jesse Scouts have sort of several layers. One is to lead the armies, but a new group called Blazers Independent Scouts are formed. And this in many ways is it's an origin of the modern counterinsurgency in the United States Army. This specific small company of men led by Richard Blazer and another individual who was the founder of the LA Times later on. It becomes one command within a month, and they pursue the Thurman's Rangers and irregulars very ruthlessly but effectively, in the sense that they piece together intelligence. They're questioning people. They're not attacking everything in sight. It's surgical strikes, and it's very effective. And as this is all going on, the other story sort of is emerging as well, and that's a story of John Singleton Mosby and his Rangers. And that's an amazing story that begins in 1862, where Mosby, after leading several of Jeb Stuart's special cavalry rides, gets sort of a renown for himself. He's a brilliant man. He's a lawyer prior to the war. He doesn't believe in secession at first, but once he's in, he's a very devoted soldier and a very earnest and brilliant soldier. And he's relied upon by Jeb Stuart, even as a lieutenant. And he asked Stuart to give him the ability to create a partisan force, a force of men that will irregularly attack Union lines. And Stuart says, fine, you got one guy with a club foot. And Mosby goes out, and a few days later he's at a train station, and he is not even armed. His pistols are in the saddle, and there's a Union company of men surround the the train station, and he is captured. And his run as a partisan leader is short-lived, but Mosby's the kind of guy that can make lemons out of lemonade. And what I mean by that is he is detained by federal authorities, he's imprisoned, and he is eventually, after a few months, he's able to return to the South under a prisoner exchange, where a Union prisoner is exchanged for him. And it's during his trip back to Richmond on a steamboat that John Singleton Mosby sort of pulls off the miraculous. He spots that the captain on the boat he just has this sense that the guy's got Southern sympathies, starts to probe and question him and find out, oh, yeah, there's different troop movements that are forming, and he's able to take this raw intelligence and take it and put it in context that there's really strategic value in it. And he's also observing troop movements as he's going down the James River, gets off at Richmond. Instead of, he's exhausted from being in prison so long, instead of trying to go get a meal, he immediately rides to Robert E. Lee's headquarters, where he informs the general. I mean, he comes in as sort of an unexpected guest and a lowly lieutenant, but he's able to pierce that, has the gravitas to present directly to Robert E. Lee that, there's something definitely afoot with the Union, and here's what's going on. And it's the Battle of Cedar Mountain, that intelligence that Mosby gives Robert E. Lee that plays a vital role in that battle. And that begins his career again as a chance to be a partisan leader. And it's the area here is so rich in history. Of Mosby's grave, we have his law office. There's a townhouse right next to the courthouse, which was where, according to legend, the town was surrounded by Yankee troops. And where's John Singleton Mosby? Oh, we have no idea. And he's sitting in a chair with, shaving cream on and a towel. And we haven't seen him. And, everybody, he escapes so many times. And he's wounded many times as well. But it's in Middleburg, in one of the mansions there, in the winter of 1862, in the final days, that he approaches Stuart again and says, look, I want to command a partisan unit. And he's given that opportunity. Instead of one guy with a club foot, he's given about 6 men, a handful of men, including his best friend, Font Beatty. And they go out, and they start to change history. And it's really incredible. They're very effective on small raids. And Mosby understands it's not necessarily about, the wagon raid. It's about tying up all kinds of troops because they're chasing him. And but his real acclaim comes when a deserter from the 5th New York Cavalry, a guy by the name of Big Yankee Ames, walks into the camp. And he's unarmed. They're immediately suspicious of who this guy is. But Mosby has a sense that he's being honest. He says he deserts his command, the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not what he was fighting about. He says he was fighting about preserving the Union. And he said, I'm not going to fight with 5th New York. I want to fight with you. And they're a little bit surprised. They send him out by himself with one other man, unarmed. And his mission is to get a horse. He has to go back into Union lines at Centerville, where there's a massive cavalry encampment, and steal a horse. And he does that. He comes back, and this guy's pretty impressive. They still don't totally trust him. But it sets up one of Mosby's greatest raids, and really one of the greatest special operations missions in American history. It's the Fairfax raid, where they go after a Yankee general, and they go into Union lines, into an area that is just swarming and infested with thousands of Union cavalrymen and thousands of troops, and they ride into Fairfax City, and they're doing it with raincoats. They're wearing some Union uniforms, but they have Big Yankee Ames out front. He knows the passwords. He knows sort of the ways to get through pickets. And it's a rainy night, there's some sleet, and this small force of, a few dozen men penetrate Union lines. They make their way into the headquarters area. They find Stoughton asleep, and, the famous line, he goes, well, he kind of wakes this guy up, and he said, you know who John Singleton Mosby is? And the general's sort of like, he's groggy, he says, yeah, you caught him? No, it's he who has captured you. And, makes this guy get dressed, and then they make this epic ride back through Union lines with the prisoners, and they come here to Warrenton. And Stoughton is captured, and he's a sensation within the North and the South for this incredible special operations mission, which changes the course of history. And it causes an influx of men to want to join Mosby's Rangers. This story is continuing to unfold. The book captures some of the greatest exploits that Mosby has. And the two stories are kind of moving in parallel. The Jesse Scouts are in West Virginia. Mosby's Rangers are effective and doing a great deal of damage here in the Fauquier, Loudoun County area, known as Mosby's Confederacy. And it's as these two stories continue to move forward, they two will meet. The two groups will meet, and they meet at what's known as the Berryville Wagon Raid. And I'm going to pass through a lot of history here because the Jesse Scouts do a number of things in the spring of 1864. But it's at the Berryville Wagon Raid where there's a new commander on the field, Philip Sheridan, and he's moving his supply wagons without the proper escort. And there are hundreds of wagons. This is a wagon train that is, a mile long. It's massive. And Mosby sees an opportunity, assembles much of his command, which in the late summer of 1864 is now grown from this tiny handful of guys to hundreds of men. And they hit the wagon train. There's a lot of really great color here. They initially run over a hornet's nest, and the hornets are hitting the Rangers as well as the men in the wagons. They somehow, they have another howitzer. They're able to, attack some of the lead wagons, and then they just destroy scores of these wagons. And it's a massive embarrassment for Philip Sheridan. It's a massive embarrassment for the South, and for the North as well, because this is the forever war at this point. It's 1864, and things are not going well for the Union. Jubal Early, only a few weeks earlier, had almost taken Washington, D.C. He should have worked with John Singleton Mosby, but the two men hated each other. That's another story. But it's the re-election of Abraham Lincoln isn't looking good at all. It's the forever war. And it's here that my other interesting group sort of emerges, and that is the Confederate Secret Service. And their story is an interesting one. They are a group of men and women that have to improvise because the war is not going well for them. So they improvise and they create different departments on the fly. They have a sort of an obsession with gadgets. They build time bombs, torpedoes, landmines, exploding devices, the Hunley, different things like that. But they also have something that is 100 years ahead of their time, and that is a department that specializes in election interference. And all of this happens in one of their outposts up north in Montreal, where in the spring of 1864, Jefferson Davis authorized the Confederate Secret Service and his ambassadors for peace, as they were called, and gave them $2 million in gold to go up north to try to influence things and also use special operations in irregular warfare to change the course of the war. And that's exactly what they start to do, and it's incredible. And one of the triggers for this is a Union raid called the Dahlgren Raid, where John Dahlgren and his father is the famous Dahlgren gun. They have a raid on Richmond where there's two forces. One is a decoy force, and the other is under Kilpatrick, and the other is under Dahlgren. And they're hitting Richmond from the western side. And their mission is to burn Richmond to the ground and to kill Jefferson Davis and the entire cabinet, as well as free any Union prisoners that are down there and hopefully use them to help them. This raid does not go well, but what it does is it triggers the Confederacy to respond in kind with their own special operations. And one of the most sophisticated aspects of it is in Montreal, where the Confederate Secret Service sets up in the most opulent hotel. It's here that mint juleps are served year-round. They have a billiards room to cater to the Southerners that are expatriates or even Southern prisoners of war that somehow escaped up there. And they start to hatch plans and plot things. And one of the things that they do that's really remarkable is they have press influence operations where they're paying off editors in northern papers to write stories in the northern press about the Forever War and how it's not going well. Different little things like that. My favorite quote in the book is by really one of the most interesting characters. He's a fat, kind of rotund man that has beautiful women all the time around him. He's piratical, that's one of the terms that they use. He's an operative, a political operative. And one of his favorite sayings is that at that time, the democracy is in possession of the press. The democracy being the Democratic Party. And they planned to influence the peace Democrats that wanted to end the Forever War. And they laced papers that were operated by the democracy with negative stories, but then they also funded the Copperhead movement. And their chief asset was Clement Laird Vallandigham, who was a congressman from Ohio that made a number of anti-war inflammatory speeches. He was a Confederate sympathizer. Abraham Lincoln exiled him, first goes to the South, and he then ends up in Canada. And the Secret Service is basically, he is an agent of them. They do all kinds of amazing things. They plan within the structure of a peace conference, which is a phony peace conference. They utilize the Associated Press to put out different things that they don't, they're then even organizing the origins of what we now know as a color revolution. And this is an insurrection in the North. And they utilize operatives that are ex-Confederate soldiers that are in Montreal, and then they infiltrate the Copperhead movement, where there are hundreds of thousands of members of this unit that all want peace, but in some cases they're willing to do it very violently. So they plan an insurrection. And all of this is going on in August, where the Confederate Secret Service literally writes the campaign platform for the Peace Democrats, which is an armistice for the Civil War to end and to stop hostilities. Clement Laird Vallandigham will be the Secretary of War, and their right-hand man will be the Vice President with George McClellan. And the platform is peace and an end to the war with an armistice. And all of this is going on at the time of the Berryville wagon raid, where it's the information war that is raging. The war between ideas and words, the wagon raid, it looks like the South is winning, but it's not even that. The South doesn't have to win. They have to survive. And they also have to influence the election. And it looks like Abraham Lincoln is going to lose. He tells his entire cabinet that I will lose, I'm going to lose. It's a matter of how badly I'm going to be beaten. Even has a letter that he makes his cabinet members sign that they will still prosecute the war up until the final day of his presidency. And they continue to fight on. And it's there that the Jesse Scouts pull off one of their greatest operations and change the course of the war. The war is not going well, and it's at the Third Battle of Winchester, along with the Battle of Atlanta, which is about a week earlier, where the war will change, and change dramatically. It's at the Third Battle of Winchester that the Jesse Scouts really shine, though. And it's a story of civilians, of an African-American man, Thomas Laws, that will put everything on the line, along with Rebecca Wright, who's in a divided family. And it's here that the Jesse Scouts find Thomas Laws, as an asset, a man that can be potentially trusted to carry messages back and forth. He's an enslaved man, but he tells the Jesse Scouts that he's able to travel freely between Berryville and Winchester because of his master. And the Jesse Scouts, in the dead of night, transport him directly to Philip Sheridan, and they have a meeting on a log. It's an incredible story. And Sheridan trusts this man. And his first mission is to deliver a message to the school teacher named Rebecca Wright, who Sheridan's sort of right-hand lieutenant, George Crook, knows before the war as a reliable and trusted Union sympathizer. And the Jesse Scouts deliver the message first to Laws. Laws delivers the message to Wright. She agrees to work with the Jesse Scouts, and she agrees to furnish them any valuable intelligence that may be important. She finds out that she kind of runs, in a sense, a boarding house, that an entire brigade under Kershaw is leaving Winchester. And this is important. Laws delivers the message to the Jesse Scouts deliver it to Sheridan, and Sheridan uses that information that Jubal Early has weakened his lines around Winchester to launch a massive attack at 3rd Winchester. The Jesse Scouts find the weak spots in the line, and it changes the course of the war, along with the 3rd battle of the Battle of Atlanta. The trajectory of the presidential campaign is altered. It now looks like the North can win the war, and everything changes. There's the Peace Democrats jettison their plans for an armistice, and they move forward. But it's the Confederacy is not done by any means. In fact, they accelerate their efforts in Montreal to do nefarious things. And one of them is to kidnap the President of the United States. And this is a response to the Dahlgren raid. But before that, they plan to tactically change things on the battlefield. And it's here that at Cedar Creek, on a little bit past the midpoint in October, that John Brown Gordon devises a plan that will change the course of the war, at least from the perspective of the presidential campaign. They see outside of Winchester that the Union lines are not guarded near Massanutten Mountain. They leave it open because they think that there's nobody that possibly can attack, because the mountain itself provides reliable defense. But Gordon goes up on top of the mountain, spots the weakness, and then plans an epic, dawn assault. And the men strip themselves of canteens. They move across a small winding trail that goes near the river, near the mountain, and then they attack on the morning of October 18th. And it's a shock. These men are kind of wraith-like. They kind of come out of nowhere, and they surprise Sheridan's entire army, and it's a rout. Most of the army is falling back in disaster, and it's here that it's sort of the metaphor for much of the war, really. They're falling back, there's chaos, and Jubal Early is on the verge of having a massive victory that will be resounding. And it's Jubal Early, it's called the fatal pause. He decides to halt the attack and pause. They're finished, they're done. Gordon said, no, they're not. And then they hear in the distance, they think another corps is coming up to reinforce the army. There's shouts, and up and down the line. And it's General Sheridan, who is riding from Winchester all the way to Belle Grove Plantation and near the lines. And it's the reinforcements of one guy that rallies the entire Union Army. And they destroy, they basically force Early to retreat. And it's really an incredible victory that Lincoln piggybacks on, the famous saying, "You don't change horses in midstream," and wins the election. And it's here though that the Jesse Scouts really come into their own. They become Sheridan's personal scouts, and they're leading the armies. They're also going after Mosby at this time. And it's a transformative event, though, is on November 18th, 1864, in a place hardly anybody's ever heard of, Myerstown or Cabletown, where Richard Blazer and his men are operating. And they had destroyed 2 of Mosby's companies over the last several weeks. And Mosby decides to finally vanquish the Jesse Scouts in the form of Blazer Scouts. And he organizes 3 companies. And it's really an incredible battle that occurs near the river's edge, where the Jesse Scouts are lured in. Dolly Richards, who's Mosby's second in command, faints that he's moving off the field with one company, while another company is behind a ridge or a small hill. And Blazer moves in with their long-range Spencer carbines and rifles, and they're basically surrounded and nearly annihilated. And they run. Many of the men are killed, or they're running for their lives, including Richard Blazer. And Richard Blazer then meets one of the main characters of my book, Lewis Powell. And Powell is one of the great rangers in Mosby's Rangers, an incredibly skillful ranger with a gun. He's very savvy, able to talk himself out of any situation, captures Blazer with several other men, and they are moved down to Richmond. And it's here in Richmond that Lewis Powell works with his handlers, the Confederate Secret Service. And it's there that the plot to kidnap the President of the United States is advanced forward. And he's brought back here to Warrenton, where Warrenton doesn't really do much. There's a really great story that I dug out of the archives, specifically the court records, where it's here in the square, right in Warrenton, that Lewis Powell, Powell the Terrible is what he's called after the war, saves Union soldiers from death, from a mob, and protects them. And it's Lewis Powell that just sort of hangs out for several weeks, tells some of his closest confidants that he's going to be on a secret mission to capture the president. And then he suddenly disappears. And the story that everyone is told is that he deserts from Mosby's Rangers. And the book gets into great detail about how he's handled by the Confederate Secret Service and his handlers, and there's lots of documentation on it. But it's in this time frame that the war moves forward as well. And it's Philip Sheridan and the Jesse Scouts that are going to play a major role in it. And they're tied up here in some ways by Mosby. Mosby destroys the Manassas Gap Railroad, goes after their supply lines, ties up hundreds of troops. Philip Sheridan doesn't actually move from Winchester until March 1865. Grant had been begging him to move south, towards south specifically, to join Sherman for many, many months. And he finally moves out. It's the Jesse Scouts that are moving up in advance. They have one of the great special operations. It's a story of survival. At this point, you have an army on the move. It's very difficult to deliver a message when you're on the move. There's no telegraph stations in the South where they're moving through towards Richmond. So Sheridan tasks 2 of his best scouts to deliver a message to Grant. And they have to go through over 100 miles through enemy lines. They have to impersonate Confederates. They're carrying in their mouths a tinfoil message that's 3 pages long. And if they're captured, they're to swallow the message. And somehow, miraculously, they make their way into the siege of Petersburg, break through Confederate lines, and then make their way into General Grant's headquarters, where they're astounded that these guys somehow got through all of the Confederates to deliver the message. And the message is, I'm coming, and I want to reinforce you, not Sheridan, who was in North Carolina at this time. And historically, all of these events are occurring 160 years ago on these days right now. Sheridan is trying to convince Grant that he should stay and attack, because that's where the war will be won. And it was yesterday was the Battle of Five Forks, and yesterday was the fish fry that doomed the South. And that is a great story, where how a small, tiny event can change history. And that event occurs on March 31st when Tom Tex Roser, Major General Tom Tex Roser, in his headquarters wagon is moving to Five Forks to reinforce it. Robert E. Lee tells Pickett and his other major generals that they must hold Five Forks at all costs, because if they don't, they will flank the Petersburg defenses, they will cut off the last supply lines into Richmond and Petersburg, and they will have to evacuate the trenches around Petersburg. And it's here that they cross a stream that's teeming with shadfish, and Roser pulls out, he finds a local farmer that has some nets. They pull out hundreds of fish from the river, put them in the headquarters wagon, and then the day that they are supposed to hold at all costs, he decides to invite General Pickett and his entire staff to a shad bake. And they don't bother to tell their subordinates where they're going. The war seems to just go away at the bake, at the luncheon. It's just like before the war, there wasn't even a war going on. Servants with wine are serving the generals. They're getting fish, on plates, and they're having a great time. And interestingly enough, an acoustic anomaly occurs, where their headquarters is only about a mile behind the lines, where Sheridan is attacking. But they can't hear any gunfire or the fire of cannons. And they think everything is fine, until they realize, as they're eating their fish, there's suddenly Yankee soldiers crawling all over the place in the woods. Pickett and several of the other men ride through these Yankee skirmishers, somehow get to their lines, but it's too late, because the Jesse Scouts have already pinpointed where the weaknesses are in the line. And it's General Sheridan, with the Jesse Scouts, in some cases right next to him, leading the attack. And he breaks through the defenses. The fish fry, the leadership, the most important hour of the Confederacy, the leadership is literally out to lunch. And Sheridan rides through a hail of bullets, breaks the line with the Jesse Scouts, and the Jesse Scouts continue to have a significant role in the Appomattox campaign. What happens now is that Robert E. Lee's army was going to evacuate Petersburg, but in 3 or 4 weeks. Their entire timetable has been thrown off. Lee's plan would eventually be to link up with Joseph Johnson in North Carolina. But now the entire timetable is destroyed. And the Jesse Scouts intercept a message. Some of the messages, one of them is to Amelia Courthouse. There's some suspicion and evidence that message was about the food that was supposed to go to Amelia Courthouse, the first rendezvous point for the Army. And Lee, despite all of the disasters that are occurring, he still has at least a 12-hour start on the Union Army, and he's moving quickly. A retreating army almost always retreats when they want to on the Civil War battlefields. They're very effective. The Army of Northern Virginia was extremely effective. and things are looking good. But they get to Amelia Courthouse, and they open up, there's a trainload of supplies there, but they're wagon caissons and everything that they don't need. And it's the Jesse Scouts that are one step ahead of them on the entire journey. They're leading people down the wrong road in some cases. They are then given by Sheridan their most important mission, which is to find Lee's supply trains. They're told to go, 2 men are supposed to go to Danville, and the other 2 men are supposed to go to Lynchburg. And on horseback, in their Confederate uniforms, they basically ride alongside the rails. And it's here that they encounter Lee's supply trains. And they have messages that they then order the trains to move out of Lynchburg, where they're in a position where they can be seized. And they send, one of the scouts goes back to inform General Custer where the trains are located, and they seize the trains. And this is a seismic impact on the entire war, because Lee is desperate. He does not have supplies. His army and men are hungry. They're still very willing to fight, but they are hungry, and he doesn't know where the supply trains are. And it's that morning near Appomattox that John Brown Gordon is given the final attack to break out towards Lynchburg. In the attack, it goes up against Sheridan's men, who are in position thanks to the Jesse Scouts where they're at, and it fails. But it's here that Robert E. Lee is given direct orders by Jefferson Davis to break out and to conduct guerrilla warfare. And the road was open to the north, and there was openings in other areas as well. Sheridan did not have the army surrounded by any means. And it's Robert E. Lee that will change the course of history. It's at Appomattox that the United States will come together again. And it's at Appomattox that real statesmanship on both sides and reconciliation and forgiveness and dignity come to play. Robert E. Lee is told by his lieutenants, his battle captains, the main generals that are there, that they should break out, or they should disperse the army and conduct guerrilla warfare. They can get into the Blue Ridge Mountains, and they can break up the army, and most of it will be able to survive. It's Robert E. Lee that disobeys that order and says, look, you can do whatever you want, but I'm not going to be bushwhacking in the Blue Ridges. I'm going to go to General Grant. And it's here that General Grant does not look at these men as traitors. He looks at them as fellow Americans and offers them honorable terms. This is where everything changes, and respect is given and dignity in honorable terms. To the south, John Brown Gordon is given the opportunity to parade the Army of Northern Virginia in front of the Union soldiers, and they're told not to jeer, and it's Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain that gives him effectively a salute, and it's, honor meeting honor, as they said, and it creates the honorable terms for the Army of Northern Virginia, which was duplicated then for all the other Southern armies, and it has a profound impact, because instead of putting all these men into POW cages, they are paroled and told to go home. And that has a massive impact on everybody from, at this point, it's Jefferson Davis who's fleeing for his life, going from one little capital to another. It's at Abbeville, South Carolina, that he holds his final meeting. And they ask, he asks his men, should we continue? And what he sees, what the men see, are all these guys that are paroled going back home. And they recognize that it's over. Even though the reality is that the South had not been occupied by a large percentage of the Union troops, and an insurgency that has the support of a civilian population is almost impossible to defeat. We see that over and over in the 20th century, and in other conflicts, and today. And but it's Robert E. Lee that changes things, as well as General Grant, as well as Philip Sheridan, as well as the Jesse Scouts. It's about, the collective actions of individuals that will change the course of history. A single person can change the course of history. Thomas Laws, Rebecca Wright, or the Jesse Scouts. When, at the end of the war, when they say to General Sheridan, how did you do it at Appomattox? And he said, it was my scouts. And they just looked at him like, we have scouts too. He's like, you didn't have my scouts. And that's the fact and reality. And, we look at the war, how it ends. And the war with John Singleton Mosby ends interesting. He will be on the run all the way through June. And he basically gives himself up a day or so right at the end of the Lincoln trial, the assassinators. And it's his men, I get into this detail, his men find John Wilkes Booth and bring him towards the Garrett farm. That's a whole other story. But he's on the run, and it's his wife that writes General Grant and asks, can you just stop, hounding my husband? And he has a meeting with Grant, and the two men form a friendship and a bond. And John Singleton Mosby becomes Grant's campaign manager. He becomes a Republican. One of my favorite lines in the book is, well, what's it like to be a Republican? It worked. Civil War. Hell is being a Republican. It worked in the South, in Virginia. And he is literally, Claire's Depot over here, he was shot at by one of his own men, they think, and almost killed near that depot as he was trying to get on a train. But he does amazing things. After the war, he becomes he becomes an ambassador to Hong Kong. He stops women trafficking. He meets a young George Patton in California, and leads in a really interesting life. It's a story of, all these stories are about how a single individual can change history. And his legacy and the legacy of the Jesse Scouts, they still live on in today's Special Operations Forces. Thank you very much.